Okay, class, so let's get started. It's a delight to be here again for class number 6. And last time we were talking about the profiting from innovation paradigm, which is actually an element, if you will, of dynamic capabilities. If you've got a good frame of reference for dynamic capabilities, if you've got that mental model in your head, so to speak, then when it comes to the seizing or execution, then one of the tools that you can have, the strategic tool that you can have to help you with execution, is profiting from innovation. So let's go back to the major theme here, that dynamic capabilities is this umbrella organizing framework that brings together basically business strategy, organizational development, and innovation all in one. And because this is such a complicated area, you need an organizing framework. You need some kind of overarching mental model to know what to prioritize. Otherwise, there's too much and you won't know what to focus on. And also, in order to integrate all the disparate knowledge and ideas and concepts and phenomena that you encounter in everyday life. So that's why we've got the dynamic capabilities framework. Not a theory, it's a framework. So we started the first class with a very brief overview of dynamic capabilities. And this being the last class before the midterm, I thought we would just sort of go back into the key the key units, if you will, or aggregating units of dynamic capabilities, which is sensing, seizing, and transforming. So that's where we're going today. And I'm going to draw from a number of the different papers that I've asked you to read. I'm not just going one paper through to the next. There's a lot of overlap, but this, hopefully what I'm going to do today will help you organize all of this material. And this presentation today really tracks substantially the organization logic, or the logic of the 2007 paper called Explicating Dynamic Capabilities. So by explicating, I'm referring to not so much the micro foundations in the sense of the individual level components, but let's getting down into the weeds of, well, okay, so sensing, what does it really mean, and how do you do it? Seizing, execution, what are the key things? What are the pitfalls? What are the decision errors? What are the things you have to be alert to? And then transforming, what are the key elements of that? So it's really just digging down deeper to the foundations, if you will, to the foundations of dynamic capabilities. So here we are. Let's begin with sensing. And figure 1 essentially defines sensing as the analytical systems and individual capacities to learn and to sense, filter, shape, and calibrate opportunities. I should probably add opportunities and threats as well. It's not just opportunities, it can also be threats. But usually every threat contains an opportunity with it. The old story, there's a silver lining in everything. And so I don't apologize for not having put in threat, because with every threat there is an opportunity. So let's sort of go clockwise around those various categories of things that I've identified there. How do you sense? Well, one way to do it is through actually monitoring what I call exogenous science and technology. So scanning the horizon, what are other people up to? What are the new technologies that might make a difference? If you're Uber, obviously understanding that 4G is coming, and that's going to allow apps of the kind that we eventually got and quickly got with Uber and with Lyft. But if you were not alert to the fact that technology was coming, and it wasn't hard to be alert to it because the carriers were blurting out that it's coming, you could go and find the technical specs 5 years before they were implemented. So a lot of this is not rocket science. Um, so you need to essentially be thinking ahead and figuring out what's the direction of evolution of the industry, what's the direction of evolution of the technology. And then, of course, there's always lots of technologies. So the question is, what's the important one? I mean, take storage, electricity storage. The whole key to moving to alternative technologies is grid level storage. So, what's important? Batteries are important. Well, batteries are not the only form of storage in the grid. You can pump water uphill and then downhill again. But what are the various things that are going to be necessary to unlock the bottleneck associated with alternative fuels such as solar and wind, or the tides in the ocean? Actually, the tides are predictable, but sunshine is less predictable and wind is less predictable. And so you don't want to, you've got to cover those situations. Otherwise, those technologies are not useful. So right now, it's pretty obvious to everybody that there is a tremendous demand for energy storage. But what does that mean? Does it mean grid level energy storage? And if so, what are the properties of grid level? It means low cost. What is it? What else does it mean? Does it mean density? Thinking about these things before everybody else is alert to them is how you discover opportunities. So that's looking on the northeast box. So what are other people doing? And then secondly, on the northwest box is what are you doing yourself? Your own research and development is a discovery process. Think of R&D as a discovery process, and it's a way that you create opportunities. But with every company, and of course my Haas colleague Henry Chesbrough has driven this home better than anybody with this whole open innovation movement. No matter who you are, whether you're Google, whether you're IBM in the past, whoever you are, you're only contributing, a single digit, at best, a single digit percentage of the world's stock of knowledge, usually less than 1%. So being alert to where the other 99% is coming from is critical. And that sounds pretty simple, but guess what? A lot of folks used to have, and many still do have, a not invented here syndrome, where they're only looking at their own technology and they get so carried away with what they're doing that they're blinded to what other people are doing. So sensing and sense making involves, amongst other things, monitoring technological developments and contributing to them. And then the other part of this is you cannot effectively use other people's technologies unless you're actually an expert yourself. Another one of our Berkeley colleagues, Professor David Teece, did the first work which documented that in-house R&D and external R&D should be thought of as complements, not substitutes. You don't do in-house because there is not sufficient external technology. You might. That's not the only reason. These things are complements. Internal research and development and outsourcing or open innovation and in-house R&D, think of them as complements, not substitutes. A very basic point, but I guarantee you 8 out of 10 people get that upside down. Then in the southeast quadrant there, box, should I say, I've got processes to identify target market segments, changing customer needs and customer innovation. Customers themselves are a source of innovation. Users are a source of innovation. Not in terms of the average consumer, but particularly sophisticated business users are a source of innovation. If you look at the scientific equipment industry, 90% of the equipment actually comes from scientists inventing new things in their lab, and then some scientific equipment company taking it and making it more elegant and more cost efficient and easier. So customers are a key source of innovation, but figuring out where the market demand is and where the problems are. Well, how do you figure that out? Well, you got to stay in the market and be in the market. And many venture capitalists have the discipline. They won't invest in a company unless they're confident that the entrepreneur founder actually is closely working with customers. I know here on campus that many venture capitalists, if a faculty member of engineering wants to start a new company, so why don't you take 2 years off and go talk to everyone who's going to use the cool invention you say that you have, and then after that, if you're still keen on doing it, I'll fund you. That is to say that understanding the customer is absolutely critical, and once again, it seems simple, but particularly very capable technological geniuses are often carried away with the technology and focused on that, not on the customer, and then they kind of understand why when they invent something and commercialize it, that the market is much smaller than they thought. It's because they haven't, wrapped it up in a user-friendly way, or they haven't really paid attention to what the customer's needs are. So moving now to the Southwest box, processes to tap supplier and complementary innovation. So pointing out that it's not just competitive information, it's looking upstream and looking to complement it as well. So sensing is very much a scanning operation, and scanning the environment as well as doing purposeful discovery processes in-house, and that way you can get a better chance of figuring out the future and having a product that's going to serve customer needs in the future. So are there any questions about sensing before we move on to talk about what I call seizing? Well, I'll just continue a little bit. I don't see any questions there right now, but I'm sure you're thinking about some. So let's talk a little bit more about execution. Remember the story of Xerox PARC? They did a fantastic job on all of this, and they did most of it through research and development and bringing together the top talent in the whole of the United States to create what became the personal computer industry. But then they sat on their hands. Not the scientists didn't sit on their hands, but the guys back in Stamford, Connecticut, the executives, were doing mergers and acquisitions and distracted and didn't invest time to understand what their own people had done. So this is not just about the organization looking externally. It's not just about the organization spending money on R&D. It's also about execution. What are the elements of good execution? Well, as the center bubble indicates, this is about having the right enterprise structure, procedures, designs, and incentives for seizing opportunities. And remember, the big problem that existing incumbent companies have is there's an enemy in the tent. And the enemy in the tent is your existing businesses. Existing businesses often don't want innovation, particularly if it's something that cannibalizes their existing market. But the irony of organizations is that it's the organization themselves, especially successful ones, that create internal enemies, which are the people that would like to be left alone to do their job. Thank you very much. And I don't want to hear about something that's going to make things better unless my customers are yelling for it. And even then, I may be reluctant. But if it's a different set of customers from what I'm currently serving, you can be sure that I'm not going to get a terrific welcome from inside the organization, from my peers and colleagues, unless you've got the right culture in the organization, which says, hey, we're always open to innovation and bring it on, and we don't care. If we don't disrupt ourselves, someone else is going to disrupt us. So that's the culture you need, and quite frankly, it's a culture that Silicon Valley has. That's the salvation to Silicon Valley, is Silicon Valley companies don't mind disrupting themselves. So So let's go through the elements of seizing then. Once again, we'll start in the Northeast. Selecting enterprise boundaries to manage complements and control platforms. So this is a matter of figuring out what are the specific assets that you need, what are the bottlenecks to getting this thing to market, what are the challenges I have, and what are the challenges I'm going to have in capturing value. That's what we call assessing appropriability. And basically, that's what we spent most of the last class talking about, is if I'm just first in the market, is that going to carry the day? Or do I have to rely on complements? How much can I rely on the intellectual property system? Too few companies focus on value capture. And it's not a matter of doing it sequentially, to be quite honest. While I'm saying you do the sensing and first and then the seizing, you actually, even when you're doing the sensing, you've got to think about the seizing, because if there's never going to be any way to capture value, then what's the point in figuring it all out? What's the point in doing the research and development? What's the point in scanning the environment if everybody else can copy you, reverse engineer you, and copy you? So these things need to be thought about simultaneously here for pedagogic reasons. Of course, I'm presenting it as being separable, but they're not separable issues. They've got to be looked at together. So, it's I won't spend too much time on that northeast box, because that really was what we were talking about in the last class. But the purpose of this discussion here is to show you how and where it fits in. And then in the southeast box there, I've got building loyalty and commitment, demonstrating leadership, effectively communicating, recognizing non-economic values, factors, and culture. So, getting things done involves having a culture that will accept the new and get rid of the old. And this, quite frankly, is where the Japanese do a pretty good job. By the time they actually make a decision, they got everybody behind it. So the seizing part is awfully slow to get to first base in a Japanese organization. But once you get to first base, you have to drink a lot of sake to get there. But once you get there, then things usually go pretty quickly. That's if there's anything left of the market, because while the sake drinking's going on, the competitors are usually moving forward. Moving over to the southwest box there, delineating decision-making or selecting decision-making protocols. This is a jungle, and this is where we bring in what we were talking about earlier with respect to intangible assets. Remember, with intangibles, you can't use the traditional metrics. So if you sit there and hold up an NPV lens, you're probably never going to make a decision to invest until it's too late. So you've got to recognize that there's got to be some ambiguity. That you got to recognize that the NPV is going to throw, the concern about cannibalizing your existing business will throw your NPV off. You shouldn't look at it in terms of, well, if I bring out the new product, you're going to lose sales of the old. Just assume you're going to lose sales of the old anyway, because if you don't do it, somebody else will. So that shouldn't flow in. The losses due to cannibalization, to self-cannibalization, really shouldn't be in the equation. Or if they are in the equation, you give yourself maybe a 6 months loss, because if it's a competitive marketplace, someone else will be there to cannibalize you, and you won't have any control over it. So it's probably not the right thing to do to take a subtract to the rate of return because of the fact you're cannibalizing yourself. Simple things like that mean that you got to be very careful with traditional financial metrics. And that's why, I think Jeff Bezos, when he decided to take Amazon into the cloud, I doubt he did an NPV number at all. Be a good thing for someone to look up. Maybe he did, but I'd be very surprised. I think I told you about sitting outside the board of a large incumbent OEM automobile manufacturer, and a young executive vice president come out and said the boss is asking him to come up with the NPV on autonomous vehicles. And I told him to go back in and tell him nobody knows. Think of it in terms of, think of your investments using option value thinking. I spend another $1 billion or $2 billion, I have the option to move on. And if I'm in this market in the long run, these are the kind of returns I could possibly get. But if I don't spend this money, I won't have the opportunity to play. And then in the Northwest quadrant there, we've got the whole business model thing. This is where business models come into play. And I tell you, in business school 20 years ago, nobody talked about, 25 years ago, no one talked about business models. You didn't have to. It was just sort of understood. The business model was, if you had an innovation, you make the product and you sell it. Oh, maybe there'd be a discussion about, well, maybe licensing versus selling the product. But now with the internet, there are 101 different types of new business models. So the reason why the word business model has replaced synergy as the most overused word in business is because of the internet and the new opportunities for creating and shaping new business models that it affords. So we've got to be good at business models. As I've said before, business model innovation is just as important as technological innovation itself. I like to think of the business model as designing revenue architectures. That's a David Teece phrase, but it does suggest that, it has to be right. There's good architecture and there's bad architecture when it comes to construction and buildings, and likewise with respect to business. And so figuring out what those architectures are may require some experimentation. I listened to the YouTube video of Reed Hastings telling us about how Netflix got through to doing what it was doing online, and it started as an experiment and learning, just trying lots of different things before they figured out how to get the uptake on the internet. Pure experimentation to get the business model right. They almost went broke in experimenting before they finally figured it out. So not like you're going to sit in a room somewhere and figure out the right business model. You're not going to figure it out by quoting a professor whose course you took 10 years ago or anything like that. Though there might be some clues. I would hope there'd be some clues in that exercise. But you got to figure it out by essentially operating, getting into the marketplace and talking to consumers and thinking anew and creatively about how to meet user needs and make money at the same time. So let me do one more and then I'll pause. So the next bucket of things that we put under dynamic capabilities is this transforming or reconfiguration, however you want to call it, combination, reconfiguration, and what we have in the bubble in the middle there is continuous alignment and realignment of specific tangible and intangible assets. So you've heard my diatribe on the importance of intangibles, but it's a diatribe that you really got to get facile with because they're the assets that matter, as you can see from the market cap of the big tech companies, or just the market cap of the marketplace. The big tech guys have the lion's share of market cap of the entire market, and they don't have the typical tangible assets of a General Motors or of a General Foods. So let's start again here let's start in the Northwest, decentralization and near decomposability. What one needs is some amount of decentralization. It's easier to transform if you're a bit more decentralized, because you don't have to change the whole organization at once. You can do it unit by unit, and loosely coupled structures are somewhat easier to transform than tightly coupled structures. So that's the northwest box. On the the northeast box, co-specialization, managing strategic fit so that asset combinations are value enhancing. So it's moving things around so that you maintain this constant state of co-specialization, because that's really where value comes from. And knowledge management is also critical. And I'm referring not only to learning and knowledge transfer, but to the integration of knowledge. Remember the statement of Peter Thiel about Elon Musk, that really what Elon Musk is really good at is integrating various bits of knowledge and various types of industrial knowledge and various types of data of data to produce a good outcome. And then in the southwest box, there is governance, achieving incentive alignment, minimizing agency issues, and blocking rent dissipation. So there's a lot of things around governance that are critical for transformation. I'd probably redo this slide. This slide is, it's 15 years old now, I suppose. And I'd probably put even greater emphasis on governance, and I'd add leadership in there. Absent leadership, you just can't get transformation done. So it's a bit embarrassing as I look at this slide now to realize that I didn't put leadership in there. Mind you, this went through multiple review processes with the journal, so it shows you that all my colleagues were asleep at the switch too. But I can't see how you can talk about organizational transformation without talking about the role of the leader. Lou Gerstner transforming IBM. We think of the transformation of IBM back there in the 90s and Lou Gerstner in the same sentence. It's when Hewlett-Packard had to go through a second transformation, had to bring David Packard back in to do it. It's often the founder that's critical for transformation. So anyway, some of the elements are the big buckets, and this is how it all fits together. So here you've got sensing, seizing, and transforming, and various elements or micro foundations, whatever you want to call them, sitting underneath there. So that's sort of the big hairy combination of things that you need to have your head around. They're the elements of the mental model that you need in order to really understand dynamic capabilities. So let me just do this slide, and then we can pause, and we'll see if there's anything in the chat box. So what we're talking about here is a different type of management. It's not administration. It's not sort of running a big hierarchy and creating a bunch of rules. It's doing the set of activities that we just identified. And let me just read this quote from the 2007 article. Maintaining dynamic capabilities thus requires entrepreneurial management. Don't just slide over those two words, because you don't find, in fact, until I started talking about entrepreneurial management, I'm not sure it was common in the vocabulary, in business vocabulary. People talked about managers, they talked about entrepreneurs, but the notion that managers had to be entrepreneurial was a little bit of an oxymoron. But if you look, of course, in Silicon Valley, it is in fact what they do. Look at Elon Musk again. It's big enterprises. We're not talking about tiny startups. Big enterprises run by very entrepreneurial people. I'm not saying that of Tim Cook, but I am saying it of Jeff Bezos. Tim Cook is closer to a manager, administrator type, He's got entrepreneurs under him, but after Steve Jobs passed away, Apple's got a lot of momentum, but it doesn't have that entrepreneurial verve that it once had. But other companies still do. Hastings at Netflix, clearly still does. The entrepreneurial management in question is different, but related to other managerial activity. Entrepreneurship is about sensing and understanding opportunities, getting things started, and finding new and better ways of putting things together. I talked last week to Joe Lonsdale. He's the youngest of the PayPal mafia. He was an intern at Stanford, and a lucky intern, he gets to be one of the founders of PayPal, and then went on to do a number of other companies. And when I look at what he's done, he tends to be, early stage. And he's a really, really, really talented entrepreneur. But then, he'll let somebody else take over and run the show, and move on to another company. And that way he's probably got a dozen or more companies that he's working on at once. And I think he's probably one of the youngest billionaires on the planet Earth that's created it all himself by being the entrepreneurial manager, but with his case underscoring the entrepreneurial rather than the manager. And Jeff Bezos's case, I think, he was hitting the ball out of the court on both the entrepreneurial side and the management side. And same thing with Reed Hastings. It's about creatively coordinating the assembly of disparate and usually co-specialized elements, getting approvals for non-routine activities, and sensing business opportunities. That's if you're not the founder. If you're part of the team, you got to get approvals. Every time you spend money, unless you're the founder, or even if you're the founder, you've often got to get approvals. It means you got to carry boards along with you. So this entrepreneurial stuff requires a supportive culture and supportive boards. That's what we were just showing you with the seizing and transforming boxes before. Governance matters. And very little attention on this. People talk about boards of directors, talking about compliance, but that's not the role of compliance. Can really get in the way of the kind of, you need boards that are going to not just approve things, but actually be willing to support things and take risks. If you don't take risks, then there's no opportunity. So this is a very important set of issues. And then in the last two sentences there, entrepreneurial management has little to do with analyzing and optimizing. It is more about sensing and seizing, figuring out the next big opportunity and how to address it. So, I know we've all had a lot of experience with analyzing and optimizing, but that goes in the back seat. Entrepreneurial proclivities go in the front seat and behind the driving wheel. And I won't carry the analogy forward to the autonomous vehicle for fear I'll screw it up. But let me pause right there and see what sort of questions you have about those buckets, and whether this mental model or mental framework of dynamic capabilities is starting to make sense to you, or whether we should throw it out the window and go back to 5 forces.
I have a quick question, Professor.
Please.
I'm just, I think I kind of sort of get the theory of it all, but just practically, if I'm trying to think about how, say, at my firm, they implement this, right? So we're facing quite literally an existential crisis right now at our company, but then people are still very, very involved in just analyzing and optimizing for what we have right now, just because it will continue to function for, say, the next 1 year. And we've had some sort of researchers coming in and figuring out what the next big thing to do is, but then people aren't really putting in resources and development effort and money to go on and deal with what needs to be done for say after 3 years. So how would you practically deal with both of these things at the same time? Is it almost like saying you have a strategy group that's looking at the fencing and seizing, and then
Yeah.
you have like other people who are doing the day to day, or like how does this fit?
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly important question. It's the analyzing and optimizing is what I call the ordinary capabilities. So how do you run the ordinary and the dynamic together? Well, first of all, you make sure they don't kill each other because optimizing will kill the dynamic part, and the dynamic part, actually, let me rephrase that. It's true that optimizing will kill the dynamic part, but the dynamic part may or may not kill the optimizing part. I say that in as much as sometimes the dynamic part is to say, listen, stop trying to squeeze the last penny out of this. It's time to move on to the next big thing. But I think part of the answer is different groups. Look, you have to do some amount of optimization while you're figuring out the next big thing. Okay? So think about Apple with the Apple II and the Mac, because I lived this. I went to parties, and these groups were at each other's throat. If you went to people with the Apple II division, they couldn't understand why no resources were in Apple II, and it was all going over to feed this other project called the Mac. And Jobs clearly knew what he was doing. He was letting the people with the Apple II continue doing what they're doing, bleeding the last penny he could out of it, but really the primary focus was on the Mac. So starve the resources from the ordinary and the everyday in order to move on to the new thing. So, it's a judgment call. There's no easy way to balance that, other than to say, in the new should always, and let me put it this way, the old usually in every organization has more political representation than the new. In big organizations, the old has got more political representation on resource allocation than the new. So therefore, my rule is favor the new because that's more likely to bring it closer to the balance that's needed. However, if you've got a crazy organization, which is, and I know one was always on to the next new thing, and they never really developed the next new thing, and they are poor at executing on the everyday business, then you lose the whole game. So there's two sides to this coin, but I would say in most organizational settings, favor the new because the old has got plenty of supporters. Did that make any sense to you?
It does make sense. Thank you. So I'm just sort of trying to think about this a little more practically. So it's almost like saying you have to have two separate organizations set up with like at least some amount of autonomy between the two, and then have somebody outside of those two organizations deciding which gets priority.
It's often the case, depending on your culture. I mean, with IBM and the PC, remember, they did set up a whole new organization. They moved it, they didn't set it up in New York, where the rest of IBM headquarters were. They put it down in Boca Raton, Florida, as far away from New York as they could go and still stay in the United States and in the same time zone. And they completely gave them the freedom to do what needed to be done. So from the decision making point of view, complete autonomy. And that was necessary to get it out the door in a timely fashion, because if you had to check in for resource approvals for every $10 million, IBM would not have done the PC at all. So yes, I mean, I tend to lean towards a separate organization, but what would be even better is a culture where everyone embraces the new and lets go of the old at the right time, and you'll have to tell me. I think there are some organizations, I think, Netflix, when I kind of read between the lines of what's going on there, my sense is that everyone is on the same page and there's not the two groups, that you get in so many organizations. But it's an incredibly, good question. that's easy to ask and it's got very difficult answers. Are there any other questions?
Hey, Professor, I have a piggyback question to that last question, because I think I'm coming from a similar place, as far as, I'm in middle level management. And so as, a leader in my organization, but not the highest leader in my organization, I often need to, request resources for innovative projects, for example. And one of the things that, I'm always struggling with, particularly with things that are more outside the box, is coming up with an ROI for it, right? And that's kind of coming back to this thing around the new. It's really hard to put together that ROI, right? But I need something to justify to my leadership about why they should be invested in this thing that I'm proposing. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for those of us who are kind of stuck in not that highest level, but being able to make decisions within our regional level, once we're able to kind of get allocation from up on high?
Well, I mean, the first thing you can do is, in an insulting way, put under their nose a quote to the effect that this is the wrong decision metric to use in the first place. But that doesn't always go down right. So I wouldn't necessarily do that unless I'm really sure that it'll be warmly received. I think, as I've said several times, trying to lead someone towards sort of an option theory view of things, a real option theory, which is, look, if we do this, that means that we can do something else beyond it, which will lead to bigger money. And that just as placing an option, you don't ask what the ROI on an option is. You ask the question, does this enable me to do something that my competitors won't be able to do? Is it a down payment on another opportunity? So reframing it out of an ROI by putting into real options sort of thinking is one way to go. Another way to go is to, just sort of point out that, well, there isn't an ROI that you can calculate, much as you'd like to, or, you can give them an ROI, but say, listen, you've asked for it, so here it is, but I can't tell you I have confidence on this because of the uncertainty with respect to these forecasts, or let them pick and let them say, okay, look, you talk them up, say, you understand this market's better than I, but if you think the market's this, then the ROI is that. If you think the market's that, then the ROI is this. Essentially put them in the same awkward position that you're in, but in a way that, is gently telling them that, no one really knows. Anyway, does that help? No. Well, after you fought the battle and won it, let me know, because I'll tell the next group of students how you deal with this. Well, the other way is to get sufficient seniority that you don't have to go and ask for the approval from someone else. You've got the control over the spigot yourself. Any other questions there?
Looks like we have a raised hand. Simon, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, so
Right.
there are no raised hands, right, Ian?
Looks
I
like
just need to learn how to unmute myself. Sorry about that.
there we go.
I had a question around entrepreneurial management. The fact that entrepreneurial management has little to do with analyzing and optimizing. Professor Teece, what kind of role does KPI and data have in the world of dynamic capabilities? Do you see a role of KPIs and data in transformation? I mean, it's pretty obvious that it has some role in sensing, but do you see, how should we think about KPIs and data in the dynamic capabilities framework?
Yeah, actually, I'm giving some thought to that. But some very gross level ones are R&D. I mean, if you're not spending money on R&D, you're unlikely to have dynamic capabilities unless you're the world's best at open innovation. So if I'm going to find companies that have got strong dynamic capabilities, I'm going to look to companies that are spending significantly on R&D, that have structural, you know, if you will, listing posts. You know, if you've got uh, a network of alliances and mechanisms that can enable you to monitor what's going on in the market. You know, so it's points of customer contact, it's listening posts, however the listening posts are, or the ways in which you gather information and data. So are you active? Measures of activity with respect to understanding customer and user needs, whatever those measures might be another sort of proxy. On the sensing side, on the sense making side, that's much harder. Are you good at sense making? That's sort of the, you know, you can look backwards and say, have you kind of figured out the future in the past? Doesn't always guarantee you will, but some people are pretty adept at it because they're more forward looking. And do you have the right skill set? I mean, you know, look at all those poor automotive companies that have got mechanical engineers, and really what they need is software engineers. So I'm going to say, if you don't have the right skill set in the organization, you're just not going to be able to have strong dynamic capabilities. So you know, a Tesla's going to look a lot better than Chrysler or Ford, just simply because of the distribution of talent. So you know, you kind of have to look at things along those lines. And one of the things I'm thinking of doing actually is doing. I've got, and you folks can help me with this. I've got like 150 quotes from execs that are quintessential dynamic capabilities quotes, and I want to get enough of these and then train AI on it. And then I can go and look at the earnings calls, say, and just see what the language of the executives are. Have they got the speak of entrepreneurial management and dynamic capabilities? And I'm not going to expect them to use the word dynamic capabilities, but you can tell it. I mean, when I'm reading interviews of CEOs, you know, it's kind of like an electrical shock when I hear what they say, and if they say the right things. So I think through textual analysis, I'm thinking actually of maybe I'll set up a hedge fund at some point where I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I've done it a couple of times and I've been well rewarded, but maybe I can turn this into a business. If there's something here, as I've said, it's not only good for management, but it should be a hell of a tool for figuring out, you know, where to put your investment dollars. And you know, it's not going to be Warren Buffett's, you know, analytics. It's so, you know, it's on my task list to come up with what, from an investor point of view, what are the analytics you'd use? I've actually got some models that I've done some econometrics on that are actually quite promising, but we haven't worked it all out yet. But if you come up with some, hey, there's a good course outline, not a course outline, there's a good class project for you, is to operationalize this and come up with some better metrics for assessing and KPIs for determining if you're on track. Of course, the main KPI, have they ever heard David Teece speak about this? That's got to be a KPI, right? But there's quite a number of other students of dynamic capabilities too. But it is, you know, there is a worldwide movement out there, although I've yet to organize it. No one's organized it in a meaningful way. Any other questions?
It doesn't
All
look
right,
like
so
it's.
let's, sorry, Ian, we got one more?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Um, So let's go back and dwell a little bit more on this distinction between ordinary and dynamic. This is a core distinction, although I've subsequently broken ordinary down into very ordinary and not so very ordinary, and dynamic into dynamic and really dynamic. It's really not completely black and white. There's gradations here. But, I think just to look at purpose, one's about technical efficiency, the other's about evolutionary fitness or congruence with customer needs and technological and business opportunities. So one's about one's about efficacy, and one's about efficiency. And just think of us economists who've been beating the drum of efficiency. We don't even have the word efficacy in the language of economics, but efficacy has to be as important as efficiency. So think of dynamic capabilities about efficacy and evolutionary fitness. How do you build these capabilities? Well, to some extent, both of them you build through learning. But in the case of ordinary, you can buy them. In the case of dynamic, you can't buy them. You got to build them because it's not a commodity product. There's what I call a tripartite schema, the three key elements: operate, administer, and govern, and then sense, seize, and transform for dynamic capabilities. So I'm awfully pleased we don't call the Haas School. The Haas School used to be the University of California, Berkeley School of Business Administration. And of course, I shiver now to think about that title. I'm glad it's gone. But how could you have a School of Administration as a school of ordinary capabilities? So administration is not about dynamic capabilities, but administration is, in a bureaucracy is important. And for efficiency, administration is important. But for dynamic capabilities, learning and innovation are key. Are there routines? Well, with ordinary capabilities, yes, about best practices. Over there on the right, I say maybe there's some signature processes that create dynamic capabilities, but I've actually gone a bit beyond that. There aren't simple rules. For high-level dynamic capabilities, that was I don't know how many of you attended or my debate, if you will, with Cassie Eisenhart, but we did step through it in class. I've gone a little bit beyond what I put here in saying signature processes. Dynamic capability is about reasoning from first principles, because there is no routines. There is no process to discovery. Well, there is some process to discovery, and that's what, of course, design thinking is about. There is a bit of a process there, but you're better off falling back on first principles rather than routines. What's the priority? Ordinary capabilities, about doing things right, and dynamic capabilities, doing the right things. This is a phrase I adopted from Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker is the most famous management guru in the world that never studied management, never studied economics. But if you look up Peter Drucker, half the world, what they know about management is from Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker got translated through to Chinese, and I think most of the executives in China today know Peter Drucker, and that's what they know about Western management, because they have not been to Western business schools. It's starting to change now, but it was actually pretty good what Peter Drucker had to say. He was a classical historian and a writer and an observer of business, and he had this uncanny ability to really get ahead of issues and say what was going on in very succinct ways. There's the Drucker School of Management at Claremont McKenna College, or Claremont University today, because he left his entire wealth to Claremont, which is where he lived. Imitability, well, ordinary capability, and this is the key element for competitive strategy. Ordinary capabilities are relatively imitable. Dynamic capabilities are inimitable. That's why we're focused on it here in the class on strategy, basically, is inimitability. That means that's when you can come up with, special higher level, what economists call supernormal profits. And if you do it right, it's fairly durable. So you're not, having your lunch eaten by competitors every day. That's the key thing. That's why we're talking about dynamic capabilities, because it can create a positive point of difference, and it can underscore competitive advantage. The result is, one case is about technical fitness or efficiency, the other evolutionary fitness or innovation. So that's just ways to just help anchor your mental models. And I actually think it's useful to carry these two mental models around, not just the dynamic capabilities mental model, but the ordinary capabilities. If for no other reason, that when you're in conversation, you can say, are we having a conversation about ordinary capabilities, or are we having a conversation about dynamic capabilities when you're in business settings? And I guarantee you that 9 out of 10 conversations in business settings about ordinary things, and only 1 out of 10 are about dynamic. But dynamic is where you need to be in order to get ahead. And this is a simple effort to try and pull this together in a kind of a logically coherent way. Remember that capabilities and strategy are not the same thing, that strategy has to be married to capabilities. You've got to take the capabilities you have at hand into account in formulating strategy. So I'm trying to build in there the whole concept of resources. You need to have some difficult to imitate raw materials, if you will. What are those resources that a company may have? If you're Saks Fifth Avenue, you may have some great retail store locations. That's kind of like a fixed asset. That's a resource that comes into play at the bottom there. Valuable, rare, and non-imitable resources. And it's really orchestrating all these things, the capabilities, strategy, and resources together, that leads to competitive advantage. So, dynamic capabilities, I have to admit, sometimes I think of strategy and dynamic capabilities all together, but for analytical purposes, you can separate out capabilities from strategy. You do have to have a strategy component or a strategy element in your dynamic capabilities, or to make dynamic capabilities valuable. But some people automatically do the two together. But if you really want to be pedantic, you can split it out, and that's what I've done in this diagram. So another way to think about this is that there is this relationship between the strategy elements. Remember, we relied upon Professor Ramelt's view that strategy has these 3 big elements: diagnosis, guiding policy, and coherent action. And you can see there's some overlap with dynamic capabilities. Diagnosis is about sensing. Guiding policy is about seizing. And coherent action is also about seizing and transforming. So, his notion of strategy actually indirectly includes some of these notions of dynamic capabilities. So you can choose whether you want to think of dynamic capabilities and strategy all at once, or whether you want to separate the two out. This diagram here, or this table, helps you figure out how to separate them out. And it requires different sets of skills. Diagnosis requires an entrepreneurial skill. Guiding policy is about administration, and coherent action is about leadership. So there we go. So let's just go a little further here to say, why are we fretting about dynamic capabilities? Why all the fuss? Why all the fuss? Why don't you just leave us alone, Professor Teece, because we really studied all those optimizing rules, and we know them, and you're coming along now and really upsetting me, because I thought I had it all figured out and that it was all cut and dried, and if I learned those optimization tools, I'd be a good manager. Well, I'm fretting about this because of developments in the global economy. I'm now reading that have placed a premium on the ability of companies to become entrepreneurial and agile at home and abroad, requiring in turn that management formulate and follow good strategies and organize and allow and promote flexibility, learning, and of course, innovation. Then I go on to say, this is the price of survival and growth in much of today's global economy. So why are we fretting about dynamic capabilities? Because it's the price of survival and growth. And then to my colleagues in economics, I say, however, guys, economic theory, if not management theory, is decades behind in recognizing these new realities. Managers are not decades behind. The Silicon Valley entrepreneurial managers, they've worked this all out. My job as an academic here is to try and distill what they've worked out into some reasonably digestible nuggets so that you guys can get up the learning curve as fast as possible to be able to manage and grow these companies of the future. So this is not discovery. The world, the leading firms, you can be sure the leading firms have got strong dynamic capabilities, but 2/3 of the economy doesn't. So, they've got some awfully hard work to do. A lot of companies in the Midwest and elsewhere have got some awfully hard things to do. And then also the big tech companies too, like the Intels of the world, are going to have to learn this all over again. Intel, one of the pioneers in Silicon Valley, has probably lost some of its original moxie. And now as Moore's law runs out of steam, what does Intel do next? Well, it could get away. So long as riding on the back of Moore's law, it could get away without dynamic capabilities. But the lion's back, if you will, the lion has stopped moving. So Intel has to, for the first time, think strategically and engage and brush up on its dynamic capabilities. So just to alert you to the fact that we're a little bit out in left field here, there's another big paradigm in strategy. We've talked about Michael Porter's 5 forces. There's another paradigm which is very useful called the resource-based theory of strategy, which stresses resource and access to, unique resources of one kind or another. And indeed, that's important, but that doesn't give you a dynamic framework. So what I'm saying here is the so-called resource-based approach, which we'll say more about later, is a stepping stone towards dynamic capabilities, but it doesn't get you all the way there. Now, another thing is not only the fact that, technologies are moving fast, it's also about globalization. And people don't realize that this is I think one reason why the world is moving away from globalization is that many of our citizens don't want to deal with the uncertainty that it creates, even though you can't wall yourself off from it. If it's a virus, it's not going to pay attention to national borders. But, international trade does bring uncertainty. It increases more uncertainty because there are more and more players, and your ability to really know what's going on in the global system is much harder than it is to know what's going on in a national system. So a lot of people are pushing back on globalization because they don't like the uncertainty that it creates. Most companies don't manage well with deep uncertainty. But it's not a new concept. And here I've got a quote from the famous economist Frank Knight nearly a century ago, where he says, with uncertainty present, doing things, the actual execution of activity becomes, in a real sense, a secondary part of life. The primary problem of function is deciding what to do and how to do it. I didn't discover this until I had created this dynamic capabilities framework, but I'm always shamed by smart people that figured the same thing out 100 years before. And And that statement of Frank Knight is essentially a statement of dynamic capabilities. By the way, if the Nobel Prize in Economics had been around, Frank Knight would have gotten it back then. But look at that. When there's uncertainty, the actual execution of activity becomes, in a real sense, a secondary part of life. The primary problem or function is deciding what to do and how to do it. Never is a truer thing being said. But that was the end of it. He gives us one sentence. And maybe you would say, that's enough, Professor Teece. Why do you have to burden me with all of this pages and pages on dynamic capabilities? Frank Knight's got it all in one sentence, and that's all I need. Well, if that's all you need, that's great. It's certainly the most efficient and economical statement of the ordinary dynamic capabilities nexus that I've been able to find. So a corollary of all of this is one cannot insure against unknown unknowns. Doing the right things under deep uncertainty requires entrepreneurial management. And one of the well-known venture capitalists, Bill Janeway, who lives in New York, and I met him a few times, notes that the innovation economy is saturated with unquantifiable uncertainty. But by the way, that's a quote, whoever the previous student was, that says the boss asks for an ROI on something. Taking that quote from William Janeway, the innovation economy is saturated in unquantifiable uncertainty. If it's unquantifiable, how are you going to quantify a metric to measure it? It's only going to be an artificial construct if you do. So, it's okay to push back, and don't use David Teece, use Bill Janeway, and he's a billionaire many times over. I'm not. And so he's got to be a more reliable metric. He's a very nice guy too. And he likes talking to academics, which is unusual. People that make money typically don't, but he does. And I know I'm going backwards a little bit because we covered this early on, but I'm really trying to, bookend the dynamic capabilities a little bit here by reminding you that dynamic capabilities recognizes that risk and uncertainty are very different things. Yes, if it's risk, you can quantify it. If it's uncertainty, you cannot. So that's another thing to say to the boss that asks you for the NPV and the KPI. They say, well, I can take risk into account, but I'm sorry, there's no way to quantify the unknown unknowns. Well, you can challenge your boss and say, well, if you tell me what the unknown unknowns are, I'll be happy to quantify it for you. Well, so what do you do when there's deep uncertainty? Then that's where there's a premium to agility. Second bullet point there, agility is needed to manage the latter, but not necessarily the former. And the underpinnings of agility rely on the elements of the dynamic capabilities framework. That's all of this stuff about entrepreneurial management. And a firm without entrepreneurs finding full expression isn't going to be dynamically capable. So, question before about what are some of the metrics or KPIs of a company that's dynamically capable. I talked about, if you're in the auto industry, you want to see how many software engineers you've got. If there was a way to calibrate and measure the entrepreneurial proclivities of management, that would be a heck of a good metric. But what could you do? Say, oh, have they done a startup in their background? Well, there's almost none of them have. But that would be, if someone has done a startup, even if they failed at it, I give them higher points, if you will, a higher score than someone who never tried and failed. and the entrepreneur, basically needs a platform. The point here is that you need a dynamically capable firm because entrepreneurs need to have a place where they can, orchestrate resources. And typically the entrepreneur has to build them. Elon Musk has to build all of his, and quite frankly, I've built 3 firms. No one would ever hire me to run a company. No one ever has, no one ever will, no one ever should have, probably. But I built 3 companies, and I got to manage them because, it's the only way I can get accepted onto a platform is to build it. So the entrepreneur needs to help sense the future and act upon it. So acting is part of entrepreneurship. That doesn't mean to say that every entrepreneur has to be a fantastic manager. They don't. They have to be able to coexist with good managers. And remember Eric Schmidt, when he came into Google, remember the famous quote, what are you doing here, Eric? It was, well, the founders, Page and Brin, said they needed an adult in the room. So the adult is the guy who can do the seizing part, because many entrepreneurs are fantastic at the sensing and sense making, but they can't do the execution. And the execution does require a certain amount of adult thinking. So less critical to have the entrepreneurs on the execution side, but you have to have an entrepreneurial culture or nothing will happen. You'll get no everywhere. What's the famous quote, an entrepreneur, I could build a house with all of the bricks that have been thrown at me. That's why part of the high school code is, challenge the status quo. It comes natural around here. It's a good thing about Berkeley is we do tend to challenge the status quo, although we have to make sure that the cancel culture doesn't come in and create just the opposite effect, which is you cancel everybody who disagrees with you. That's just as bad as the status quo. It is the new status quo. So where I want to go next is to talk about related paradigms. So it's early for our break, right, Ian? It's 15 minutes early, but why don't we take the break? Well, let's see if there's any more questions. If not, we'll take our 15-minute break because I'm now going to do something which hardly anybody ever does, which is after telling you what my own framework is, I then tell you what other people's frameworks are and why they're different and what's similar and what you can learn from them and what you can't learn from them. The academic world is full of people that love to create things and new ideas and peddle and push them as a silver bullet solution to every problem you have. But they don't really tell you why it's different from anybody else's, other than to tell you it's better. And what I want to do is try and pull apart some other paradigms that are, closely related in some cases and distantly related in other cases. So let's see, Ian, if we have any more questions. I don't see anything in the chat box. I don't know what happened here. Oh, yes, something just popped up. Can evolution of digital multi-sided platforms be driven by dynamic capabilities? If, then how? The answer is yes, definitely. Multi-sided platforms, someone has to, engage in sensing and sense making to figure out, okay, there's an opportunity here for Airbnb or whatever the platform is going to be. And getting it done, is very much, the Netflix story I mentioned earlier, is, you start and you experiment. They started actually with DVDs through the mail to go against Blockbuster and experiment, until they started getting feedback. People were, when they finally went online, you start getting feedback and learning and building. So absolutely, building multi-sided platforms requires dynamic capabilities. Maintaining um, multi-sided platforms requires constantly transforming and updating. Otherwise, there's a good chance another platform will knock you out of the game. And this relates to this whole tipping point thing. I mean, the policymakers say, oh, once you have a platform and once it's past a tipping point, that's it. It's locked in forever and nothing's ever going to change. That's only true if if the incumbent's got strong dynamic capabilities. You remember the quote from Intel, Andy Grove, only the paranoid survive. You've got to keep maintaining a platform. Yeah, obviously it's easier if you got a platform and you've got a lot of membership already. Switching costs are not a complete defense, and if you screw up, you can lose it. So that's obviously a much longer conversation, and in the second half of the class, I hope to get into that, multi-sided platform thing a lot more, and I would appreciate your deep engagement on that, because I wouldn't consider myself to be the world's expert on multi-sided platforms, but my friend David Evans is, and I'm reading more and more about multi-sided platforms, and I've never created one myself, at least not an electronic one. Very good question. We'll talk more about it later. But the answer is clearly yes. Platforms to survive have to be driven by dynamic capabilities. Unless you can come up with an example of a platform that stayed, never updated itself, never revised itself, didn't respond to competition and survived. I don't know of one, but if there are, let's talk about it. Any other questions, Ian? All right, it's time for that 15-minute break.
All right.
15-minute break, so we'll come back at 7:35.
Great.